And start by formally welcoming Matthew to give this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think it's going to be a fascinating topic, navigating the hidden world of cultural significance in the deep ocean. Matthew, I see you have over 20 years experience on cultural heritage and management. You've been working at Search. You have a PhD, so I'm really excited for you to kind of talk about this topic. So over to you. Final thing, just for the audience, I'll ask people to hold questions until the end, but you feel free to use the raise hand, get you in the queue, and then if we have time, we can also go to written questions in the chat. But over to you, Matthew. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Piscitelli, as Oliver mentioned. I'm an archaeologist with Search. It's a US-based cultural resource management firm. It's an honor and a privilege to speak with you all, and thank you, of course, to Impossible Metals for the invitation. Today, I want to address a dimension of deep sea mining that is sometimes overlooked, but often becomes a rather thorny point of contention in industry-specific debates. That dimension is cultural heritage. As access to the deep ocean accelerates, so too does scrutiny. The question is no longer whether vestiges of past human activity exist in the deep ocean, or what cultural significance do modern communities place on its depths. The question is, how do we responsively navigate them in an evolving regulatory and social environment? Why does this matter now? There's at least probably three converging forces that make this conversation urgent. First, technological advances are making the deep ocean more accessible. The history of deep sea exploration goes back at least over 100 years, with William Beebe and Otis Barton's attempts to observe shrimp and jellyfish in a steel bathysphere, as well as Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh's voyages aboard Trieste to Challenger Deep back in 1960. You see a sort of an artist rendition of Trieste here. Since then, James Cameron's film documentaries, Impossible Metals is, of course, testing mining robots, and the Nautilus exploration vehicle and NOAA's Okeanos Explorer continue to probe the limits of scientific inquiry. Second, regulatory agencies are still developing standards for the deep sea mining industry, and some are doing it faster than others, as evidenced, of course, by several executive orders and actions coming out of the United States. Third reason, or third sort of converging force, is that investor and public scrutiny increasingly includes social and cultural impacts, not just environmental ones. Cultural resources are no longer peripheral. They're becoming more central to these conversations. So how does one define cultural heritage? Cultural heritage is typically defined as having two aspects: the physical remains of the past and a living heritage aspect, that of cultural knowledge, beliefs, and customs of any human community. In the technical jargon of heritage management, these are called tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Taken together, these two aspects of cultural heritage constitute the places, objects, and the practices that a community values from its past and chooses to retain for future use. The phrase "kept for posterity" applies here. In previous industry-specific work, I've used the following definition for tangible cultural heritage. That is, movable or immovable objects, properties, sites, or structures with archaeological, paleontological, historical, cultural, artistic, and/or religious values, as well as the unique natural features that embody cultural values, such as sacred groves, rocks, lakes, waterfalls, and the like. This definition is drawn from the World Bank and International Finance Corporation performance standards. In a deep sea mining context, this generally means shipwrecks, downed aircraft, shark teeth, whale remains, and fossils. Our Polaroid here on the left is of the USS Yorktown, which was sunk during the Battle of Midway in the Pacific. For intangible cultural heritage, the more abstract of the two categories, I've previously adopted a definition based on the UNESCO 2003 Convention for the Protection of Intangible Cultural Heritage, and then its application by post-2012 international lender standards. That definition is practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, objects, and places that traditional groups and communities recognize as important to their way of life. These are just some definitions. There are, of course, many. In a deep sea mining context, intangible cultural heritage, this often means looking at things such as traditional fishing practices, ceremonies and beliefs associated with marine fauna, like shark calling, which is in the other Polaroid here, and traditional ocean voyaging, just to name a few. Increasingly, one might also consider relational geographies, the idea that cultural meaning is not confined to physical artifacts, but extending across entire seascapes. I'll present an interesting sort of example shortly. The deep ocean preserves archaeological materials remarkably well. The world stood up after witnessing the 8K footage from the RMS Titanic, which currently sits at 3,800 meters. The USS Nevada, pictured here, looks in pretty good shape at nearly 5,000 meters. Shipwrecks are the closest thing we have to time capsules, and they often carry global resonance. In fact, many of my maritime archaeology colleagues consider the ocean the world's largest museum, with some estimating that there are over 1 million shipwrecks spanning thousands of years lying beneath the waves. Our understanding of the global distribution of shipwrecks is consistently evolving as new discoveries are made every day. But alongside conflict-related wrecks, we also may find things like downed aircraft and potentially human remains. Jurisdiction, ownership, and the like are hot-button issues, but legal frameworks vary largely by nation. In the US, for example, naval wrecks are protected under what's called the Sunken Military Craft Act. I should also mention that under the Tangible Cultural Heritage banner, we should consider things like paleontological remains, such as shark teeth, which are frequently embedded in polymetallic nodules, and things like fossilized whale remains, as well as more recent whale falls. These examples of tangible cultural heritage carry scientific and cultural value, and there's certainly something to be on the radar for deep sea mining practitioners. Nevertheless, I'd be remiss not to make a quick PSA that archaeologists don't study dinosaurs, paleontologists do. Before I move on to other types of cultural heritage, I would like to focus a bit more on the distribution of known shipwrecks. A very recent, a very timely article was just published by Rory Quinn and collaborators in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology. You could download the article via the QR code on the slide, but we can also share the slides after the webinar. The authors combined various open-sourced, open access data sets to try and understand the exposure of underwater cultural heritage to bottom contact fishing or trawling, and of relevance to us here, deep sea mining. The figure on the left, or where it is in the screen, the big map, which admittedly is a bit challenging to read, it shows the distribution of more than 150,000 known shipwrecks, with the data presented as points on this figure mapped against depth. The wreck record spans more than 3,600 years, with 40% of those with known sinking dates. We don't know the dates of all of them, but of those that we do know, 40% of those span World War I and World War II, which is about 8,000 of those wrecks, which are like those I alluded to previously. Looking at the distribution, concentrations are greater in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, with the highest wreck density in the Baltic Sea. 95% of the wrecks are in the epipelagic zone between 0 and 200 meters, with only 1.64% of known wrecks at depths with potential for deep sea mining, which the authors derived, this potential for deep sea mining, the authors derived it from USGS data representing sort of prospective occurrence regions of ferromanganese crusts and nodules. A couple things to keep in mind here with data and sort of open access data. The nature of the research, right? Like the distribution, of course, we don't know where every shipwreck in the world is. Of these million estimated shipwrecks, this is only 150,000 of them. Why are more in the northern hemisphere? Sort of the history of contact. There's a lot of sort of factors behind it, but it's never a complete record. to keep in mind, as well as even with the USGS data, as well as it's mapped. Talking to colleagues, just because it's potentially there doesn't mean that they are there, those resources. So more science. You don't know everything from data sets and research. That's why we do the work. Similarly, not all examples of cultural heritage are visible on radar or sonar. Many peoples have deep connections to the oceans. They define their sacred and spiritual identities and practices in relation to the coast and sea. For the Haida Nation in the North American Pacific Northwest, for example, oral traditions link the Haida's emergence from the ocean to the formation of a particular seamount within a marine protected area in Canada's exclusive economic zone. For the Scandinavian Sami as well, access to the ocean and ocean resources has been instrumental in structuring the boundaries across different communities. Many Pacific island cultures divide their universe into the near sea and distant deep sea beyond the horizon, with the near sea the realm of humans and the distant sea a sacred realm of gods and ancestral spirits, often in association with a creation event. Specific gods, demigods, and ancestor spirits are often associated with marine flora and fauna, including whales, sharks, manta rays, and fish. Intangible cultural heritage is recognized under many regulatory frameworks, and consultation expectations and outcome are often the topic of much scrutiny. But not all such cultural connections to the sea are as old or as tied to creation stories, but they can nonetheless be just as powerful and central to identity. For many African diaspora communities, the Atlantic seabed is central to their definition of selves because it is a massive underwater gravesite of those who perished during the transatlantic slave trade. Philip Turner and colleagues published a 2020 call to action in marine policy, once again linked to here, where they argue for placing one or more virtual ribbons on ISA maps to depict major slave trade routes across the Atlantic, in memory of those who died during their Middle Passage. Similarly, Jim Delgado and colleagues in 2024, they investigated the Blake Plateau and noted its scientific significance, as well as cultural meaning to the Gullah Geechee people. Blake Plateau off the Atlantic seaboard of the US was famously subjected to deep sea mining tests in the 1970s. When considering these seascapes, the looming question is whether you can acknowledge cultural significance while simultaneously pursuing natural resources. As deep sea mining is thrust onto the international stage, we're faced with competing regulatory frameworks and what was already a layered legal architecture. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which was ratified in 1982, declares seabed resources the common heritage of humankind and established the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. Since 1996, the ISA has been developing a mining code for the exploration and exploitation of mineral deposits from the seabed beyond national jurisdiction. Negotiations over mining regulations are still ongoing. However, some nations have their own regulatory frameworks, and in many cases, they're designed to support the ISAs. While the United States signed the 1994 agreement, it has not ratified UNCLOS. Instead, the Deep Seabed Hard Minerals Resources Act, or DSHMRA, empowered NOAA to license exploration and commercial mining in areas beyond national jurisdiction. In other words, in international waters. DSHMRA has largely been dormant since the 1980s until some recent shakeups over the global demand for critical minerals and supply chain variables prompted an April 2025 executive order entitled Unleashing America's Offshore Critical Minerals and Resources. The overlap with the ISA is apparent and the tensions real, at least in international waters. On the US domestic side, things are a bit clearer with BOEM regulating seabed mining under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. At this point, I should emphasize that I am not a legal expert. I have experience in regulatory frameworks and environmental compliance. Nevertheless, cultural heritage is a topic within all of these regimes. On the ISA side, there's currently a specific rule, I believe it's Regulation 35, which focuses on reporting and managing underwater cultural heritage, if found during mining operations. The overall focus of conversations tends to be on tangible cultural heritage, like shipwrecks and human remains, and what procedural notifications and work stoppages would need to occur in the unlikely event of a discovery. Intangible cultural heritage concerns are still contested, less clear. It is my understanding that DSHMRA itself does not have explicit cultural heritage provisions. It's focused on licensing. However, it does have broader environmental protections and consultation requirements under existing US policy that NOAA implements all the time. Similarly, BOEM regularly follows environmental and cultural heritage regulations under NEPA, which is an umbrella environmental law, and the National Historic Preservation Act, which governs historic and archaeological sites. These are triggered under any federal action and are implemented with a wide variety of industries, ranging from oil and gas to offshore wind. Now, I think it's important that we learn some lessons from those other industries. I recently attended the International Partnering Forum, or IPF, sponsored by the Oceanic Network. We had a co-located event at that offshore wind industry conference that explored deep sea mining. As appetite for renewables ebbs and flows and changes flavor, I think there'll be quite a bit of shifting within these industries, especially when there are similarities between them, whether the use of expensive research vessels for survey, dealing with environmental compliance, and thorny stakeholder engagement. Here are a couple of those sort of consistent lessons among those industries that might be relevant to this group. Baseline assessments reduce risk. As far as I'm aware, all regulatory frameworks require some early assessment of various environmental, social, and cultural factors. In addition, mining companies themselves should be incentivized to assess the potential distribution of tangible cultural heritage for the sake of their mining equipment. Nobody wants their robot to be caught or destroyed or broken by getting snagged on a shipwreck. Pre-mining survey operations generally collect appropriate data when reviewed by a professional, qualified professional, such as, say, a search maritime archaeologist. They could potentially identify things like shipwrecks or other potential obstacles. As indicated in the Quinn paper, frequently pointed out by DSM opponents, there are knowledge gaps, and in many cases, desktop research and perusing data sets only get you so far. Nevertheless, that's why you deploy mitigation measures, such as chance finds procedures, and you establish things like avoidance buffers. Transparent reporting with clear lines of communication builds trust and prevents potential escalation, while avoidance is a less costly form of mitigation. A final external lesson I would like to briefly highlight, although I'm not sure there's a resolution or a tip here, is dealing with affected communities. Stakeholder engagement is a crucial part of any development project. I can speak to most US-based environmental compliance regimes, but there are generally clear rules about who is a stakeholder, who is what may be called a consulting party, who is a decision maker. And generally, public comment periods are included in a process. Unfortunately, with I think most of the more high-profile scenarios within DSM, the UNCLOS declaration of the ocean as common ground for humankind has kind of muddied those waters. Based on these experiences, I do think there are opportunities for DSM leaders. First, you can define best practice before regulation mandates it. While I generally argue that the myriad of regulatory frameworks are sufficient for the industry, public scrutiny seems to sometimes elevate that bar. From a cultural heritage perspective, ensure that assessments are concurrent with environmental baseline work, not an afterthought. Absent a charismatic creature such as a polar bear on a melting ice raft, human beings tend to most strongly resonate with culturally focused topics, no matter the true level of concern and documented impacts and risks. Integrate predictive modeling into seabed mapping workflows and incorporate visual verification processes along survey transects. Proactively engage with potentially affected communities, even when not legally mandated. All these measures are comparatively low cost and high yield in risk mitigation terms. Second, for DSM companies who are innovating technologically, there's real opportunity to innovate with regards to heritage stewardship. I imagine that in most stakeholder conversations, there will be confusion about exactly what deep sea mining is. I see it in the literature and the press already, where absent new data, we all fall back on what we know from a technology used 50 years ago. For communities dependent on the ocean, really focus on explaining the technology, the results of those baseline studies, and your intentions as a practitioner. We can learn many valuable lessons from professionals deeply embedded in science communication circles, using media and graphics versus hiding behind a 700-page technical report. Once again, excuse my US bias, but I'm always impressed by the efforts of NOAA Ocean Exploration, who engage with classrooms, conduct what's called telepresence missions, and consistently do good science that is then communicated to as broad of an audience as possible. BOEM similarly has developed wonderful assets, such as its virtual archaeology museum for shipwrecks in the Gulf of Mexico, some of which were actually discovered and in fact impacted by commercial activity. In addition, a common sort of complaint heard is that stakeholders often lack the necessary resources to review government documents and conduct consultation associated with impacts to cultural heritage. I'm confident that most stakeholders will agree that in principle, a 30 or 60-day review period is sufficient. However, there are always unforeseen events and circumstances. For example, approval of a document might require a tribal council's decisions, and according to their bylaws, they may only meet quarterly. Or there might be some more pressing issue than cultural heritage, for example, water security. Underlying some of these tensions are issues of resources and training. Early planning for DSM practitioners might consider the need for resources to provide Indigenous people opportunity to develop and maybe even hire their own experts. Lastly, as I tried to gloss over a bit with the various types of cultural heritage, the deep ocean is not culturally empty. It is an archive of exploration, conflict, migration, belief, and memory. If we acknowledge that reality early and embed it in operational planning, we reduce uncertainty, enhance credibility, and contribute to a fuller understanding of the human story. Starting a path forward as we probe deep, we're not just extracting minerals. We're entering a layered historic and cultural space. Navigating it thoughtfully is not an obstacle to development. It is part of ensuring responsible access. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Give me a second.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. That was a really great overview and summary, a really great insights on both the tangible and intangible parts of cultural heritage. So let me remind everybody, please use the raise hand icon, which is at the bottom of the screen, 2 icons left to the red hang up. And then you'll be placed in a queue and then unmute yourself and ask your question. And I believe Todd has already done that. So Todd, over to you. Todd, we don't hear you. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Perfect. Thanks very much for the time. And that was an excellent discussion. Thanks for that. I'd be curious to know from an archaeological perspective if you're aware of any current or past documented shapes or images that can be guided through an ML, well, actually like a machine learning model. We just built one for vanity to start, but there's nothing saying that we couldn't have a model that would be for archaeological relevant artifacts underneath the ocean that would be scanning.
So the question was, is there an image that could be used for machine learning to be able to identify sort of archaeological remains at scale, is sort of what I'm understanding. The idea of, once again, my use of the terminology, excuse AI, machine learning, large language models, I'm not going to be accurate, but I will say that desire is kind of a holy grail within the field of archaeology. We look at it from the massive amounts of remote sensing data we get, even on land, right? We do all these massive studies with LiDAR, looking in jungles, finding archaeological remains beneath the surface, but they're massive data sets. And we look for, can we somehow, instead of an individual person verifying each individual cell and looking for each individual site, can we find ways to speed this up? The challenge is that that's achievable within a particular cultural framework, at least on land, right? So looking for a house structure in the Andes Mountains among the Inca is not going to be the same as finding a Roman house somewhere in Italy. So, it could be done, but it's often on a case-by-case basis. I think the ocean might be a little bit easier in that, we do have imagery that could be used potentially. I just, the history of our use of the ocean is so vast. You might be sort of stuck into finding certain types of shipwrecks. And so you might be pigeonholing, like, hey, if this area was really traversed by 19th century steamers or something, you might be able to whittle it down there, but you'll never have sort of a global model. But I think, you can potentially have a lot of effect to explore. So I think it's possible, but situational.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to ask a question as we're waiting for others. Again, please use the raise hand icon if you'd like to ask a question. So my question is, so I think the tangible cultural heritages are relatively easy or easier to understand. And in our case, we have a lot of sensors in our vehicle and we'll document and avoid. That's, we, as you said, we don't want the equipment to get damaged. We don't want to disturb the wreck or whatever, and we'll just avoid, go around and document. Intangible is a more complex topic, and my question is, most of the people that have the cultural connection to the ocean are quite distant from the mine sites. Depending on whether you're in an exclusive economic zone, we could be 100 miles away. If we're in areas beyond national jurisdiction, we could be thousands of miles away from any coastal states or landmass. So who on the planet should be considered? Because I think if people are thousands of miles on the other side of the planet, should they be considered? Or how do we decide who should be considered on the cultural significance? Or is it everybody should be?
Yeah, that's you're sort of getting to my comment about the idea of the global commons muddying the waters in many cases. I will fall back on the official answer, be it's up to the regulator in a particular spot about who comes to the table. What are those roles and responsibilities of individuals? Public comment, everyone has a voice, everyone can comment, but how does that work out on the other end in terms of practice? Once again, is up to a regulator in those frameworks. I think that stakeholder engagement will always be tricky. I think in the cases that we've seen, you're alluding to some work that's been shared publicly about the CZZ and what we've done there. Those connections were tenuous, right? And so, the individuals that were engaged in stakeholder engagement, didn't really have that strong of a connection to the areas of mining. And I think that sort of came out in the stakeholder engagement that was done in that case. So, your question is, everyone have a seat at the table? Yes, everyone can have a voice, but in terms of where it actually impacts the project, I think that's up to the regulator. And I think this idea of geographic boundaries is still something that people cling to, but will never ultimately be defined, right? So how do you stop if one culture has a belief in the air, right? Like we believe the sky has some sort of cultural significance. Are you going to then stop air pollution in every geography? I don't think that happens. So I think there needs to be some grounding in some of the scrutiny that's happening right now.
Thank you. Sabrina, please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing your presentation. I just wanted to ask a bit some clarity. In American Samoa, our opposition to deep sea mining is not only environmental, as you mentioned, it's cultural because our ocean is part of our ancestry and identity. I guess I'm asking, how would you recommend that federal agencies and industry players evaluate cultural harm in our deep ocean areas when Pacific communities view the seafloor not as an empty space, and where our community, including cultural leaders, have already expressed immense opposition?
I think once again that comes back to the regulators in that decision-making process. They have stakeholder engagement. They engage with the appropriate individuals, and have those difficult conversations. If there's a pushback and a sort of disagreement, I think in compromising situations, everyone walks away unhappy. But I think that comes down to those conversations that's had with the regulators and the individuals who are affected. But conversations need to be had.
Thank you very much.
Michael, please unmute and ask your question.
Thanks. Matt, great presentation. Thank you. Have you seen examples of where stakeholders, those that we're talking about, indigenous and so forth, have had sort of an economic stake in the development of mining in their particular area, and how do you see that? How would you imagine that working beneficially moving forward as we develop this industry?
I think the idea of compensation is an interesting one. I sort of allude to it with the best practices and this idea of building capacity, right? I think once again of tech, since tech is such of importance in this space. It's wonderful if you come in with these amazing tools and you map the ocean or you map cultural heritage and you create these models and you say to the individuals who this cultural heritage is important to, here is a hard drive with all these data. Great. Okay, now what do I do with it? I think it's a better best practice to instead do some sort of capacity building, some sort of training, some sort of explanation that reflects why this is important and how to use those data. So that's a mindset I always think about. When it comes to the financial question, I think that's one that industry practitioners are dealing with, right? Like who benefits from these mining activities? And I think that's once again a contentious one. And I think there's a lot of great models out there. The Cook Islands has wonderful amount of collaboration with government, indigenous groups, and developers that are happening there, and I think they're sort of an example to look at. But ultimately, for communities, I think giving back financially and economically will be essential for getting over some of these hurdles.
Michael, please go ahead.
Sorry, one more from me, Matt. Storytelling, that has been a part of some of this engagement in the past, be it through the development of websites or creating media that talks about the relationship between some of the local stakeholders and the ocean bottom. Do you see this as a valuable tool moving forward, and how would you envision it potentially being applied in this market?
Creative mitigation is a wonderful example. I pointed to the Bohm Virtual Archaeology Museum. which was a proactive attempt to demonstrate, there are shipwrecks that might be impacted by oil and gas activities and other sort of, development that's happening in the Gulf of Mexico, and it raised awareness. Right? People now know more about it. So I think in a similar way, this comes back to learning from those science communication circles. If people do not understand something, you need to meet them where they are and find ways to communicate. And if that's, meaningful storytelling, I think that's a proactive thing practitioners can do to sort of lay the framework for that stakeholder engagement and better explain what they're trying to do. So I think there are examples out there that could be done to more proactively explain things. And it's all over this space, how we interpret the same data in different ways. I'm actually struck by, comments about how we don't know enough. There are knowledge gaps, of course there are. But then it's a matter of us as scientists capturing that data to then share it in peer-reviewed publications, to sort of ensure that we're doing outreach so that it's spread as far as possible, doing press. So I think it's as much a communication issue sometimes as it is a stakeholder one.
I'm going to ask another question. As deep sea mining is kind of new, it hasn't really started yet, but land-based mining has been going on forever. Are there any best practices on cultural heritage that we can learn from land-based mining?
I'm not as familiar with the land-based mining and that outreach, but I do know that with a lot of those projects, international lender standards are frequently used in those interactions. And there are plenty of cultural heritage related guidance. Our company and some of our senior advisors have actually looked at Asian Development Bank, and they're putting together a lot of wonderful tools and guidance notes that exist that communicate the why of stakeholder engagement and ways to do it well. So I think international lender standards, which have been applied to many terrestrial mining projects, would be a good place to look.
Yeah, that's great. So anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I think we will wrap up. Miramar, maybe I got your name wrong, but please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, it's Miriam. Thank you for this interesting discussion. So you mentioned a lot, of the need for discussion and escalation with communities, and like how, these are complex and data-driven issues. But you also mentioned that your view was that a 30 to 60-day comment period was sufficient in most cases. Could you sort of explain how those two things work together?
The comment there was about this idea of having enough time to have these conversations. I think it's a bit of a, in a process. It's almost like the Oliver's question about where do you stop the geography of communities and whatnot, right? Like, what does that look like? What are those bounds? How do you take a process that's supposed to apply to a variety of projects and bound it in geography? I think that same question and variable comes down to time. How do you set up a process and not put some sort of time bounding on it, right? So I think that would be, essentially impractical, not having a time element. Anyone who's done meaningful stakeholder engagement knows that, or any project really, schedules often go out the window, and that's just sort of the nature of things. And then how do you sort of catch up? I think that happens with almost every project. Sometimes they're faster, sometimes they're not. So my comment there was, you're not creating processes out of the ether, right? These ideas of time periods for, document review are not created off the top of someone's head. But of course, you need to recognize that life comes up, right? Whether there's certain things that make them more difficult or expand those boundaries. So that was the comment I was making, is that, you have a time frame and sometimes life happens in between.
Uncle Sol, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, aloha, Martin. I wanted before I ask my question is to give some context here. So I am Hawaiian. I'm a native Hawaiian. I am part of a culture that is belonging to Oceania. We have lived in the ocean for thousands of years, and we have by canoe traversed this entire area of Oceania to have inhabited the largest area of ocean on the planet. And in the last 4 years, I have been trying to bring to the ISA our cultural connection to the deep sea. And based on the current language of underwater cultural heritage, it only describes tangible things like artifacts found under the water, human remains that are found underwater, architecture that's under the water. And so I asked the question about my genealogy, which is the Kumulipo, because in my genealogy of Oceania, it says that we are created from the deep ocean, and that our eldest ancestor in the Kumulipo says that the first creature to be created in the depths of the deep sea is the ukukoakoa, or the coral polyp. And therefore, we view the coral polyp as the eldest of our ancestors, or kupuna. None of this is given any consideration in the ISA. And so it becomes a challenge in trying to bring one's cultural connection to the table and to the policy body when they don't even acknowledge that this is a part of our connection to the deep sea. And I want to make a point here that Oliver, in one of his comments recently, had noted that the cultural connection and the cultural views don't exist any longer because we have been all converted to become Christians. And I take offense to that because I am a living person who is tied to the culture, but none of that is given consideration. And even in your presentation today, you kind of lightly skim about the people of the ocean, but we have been there for thousands and thousands of years. We have been there for generations. We have had experiences based on that, and we have observations of Oceania that are generational, and therefore we carry this as an important part of a living culture of people from Oceania. And how are we now to consider that in this discussion about underwater cultural heritage? So I'd like to pose that question to you: is where do we fit in your description of underwater cultural heritage, given the kinds of comments that were made about who we are as a people that no longer exists because we are now Christians? So I'd like to ask that question.
I thank you once again, Saul, for sharing that knowledge. I think that's a very valuable thing to share, and I empathize with that idea about, I made a comment about the ISA, focusing on the tangible but still debating the intangible, because it is sometimes so challenging with any body, with many groups, to come to a consensus, which is what they're trying to do. And I'm sure you've been to those ISA conversations, but they're often long, and they have a lot of opinions that are shared. And how do you come down to a single document or single regulation and come up with one standard? It's very challenging. I will say that outside the ISA, with some of the compliance frameworks that BOEM and NOAA, they do deal with indigenous people and intangible cultural heritage all the time. That's part of those frameworks generally, and that's sort of meaningful consultation. But absolutely, communities should be at the table, part of those conversations. I would never deny that. I don't want to speak for Oliver's comments. I did see one article, I forget the name of the publication, Grist, I believe, where there was a quote of Oliver's. I won't once again speak for him, but I'd be curious, you know, at a presentation last November we gave based on previous work that we had done in the CZZ. There were comments from stakeholder engagement about the sort of how Christianity had changed some of the beliefs of those particular groups in the Pacific. Not yours, it wasn't Native Hawaiians. So I'm wondering if that knowledge, that tidbit, and this comes back to sort of how I feel generally about communication issues in general, is how you take sound bites and how those get used in multiple places. There are plenty of examples where I've read scientific articles, see how they're projected in the press, and then sort of question, you know, well, that wasn't a thorough reading of the article because I also know these other points. And so I think we have to be mindful of the world in which we live, in which there are many sound bites that sometimes rub us the wrong way.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. I feel that I was misquoted in that article. I think what was shared was a portion, not a complete. I and Impossible Metals deeply respect and understand that people have cultural connections to the ocean, and that is independent of Christianity or any other religion. So, you know, if I was disrespectful, I apologize. It's not what I believe. I think cultural connections to the ocean are very important, and we need to acknowledge them and have their input. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this webinar.
So, Matthew, a follow-up, because I did not hear you comment about our cultural connection to the deep sea. You know, that comes from a genealogy that does not talk about tangible things, but talks about the fact that we are created. So in that genealogy, it says that we are part of nature and that we have a worldview that we're not dominant over nature, but we are a part of nature. And therefore, within the genealogy, we have an inherent responsibility for its care. And that seems to be a position and a view that is not being entertained in terms of intangible. And I hate to divide cultural heritage into what is considered now tangible and intangible. It is all cultural heritage. And so the reason we talk about Hawaii's connection to the ocean is intangible, because the only definition that exists was about tangible cultural heritage. So how do we now begin to integrate the cultural heritage that is not tangible?
Yeah, I empathize. You know, when I talked about definitions of cultural heritage, I was reminded of introductory cultural anthropology classes where we're presented with dozens, if not, 100 definitions of culture. And the one that we often point to is one that's still 100 years old, that, that complex culture is that complex whole that lists, a Word document worth of things. It's everything, right? So I think defining terms like cultural heritage is just this is an exercise that is fraught with difficulty. I think the divide generally between tangible and intangible aspects is there's a practicality from a management perspective there. But you would find different definitions and different divides depending on what standards you use. So I think you're going to find lumpers and splitters all over the place, but I would still argue that considering, inclusively all those aspects, I think is important. In fact, I probably have gone further with the idea of relational geographies and seascapes by presenting that than most do. So I propose or support the idea of these inclusive definitions, but recognize there's a practicality to using certain terms or creating frameworks to help manage those resources responsibly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Eric, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I actually don't have a question, I have a comment. I'm from American Samoa, grew up there all my life. And I think there is a way forward where deep sea mining and the people of Samoa can work together for the greater good. And I think I know my people. I don't want to speak for them, but I know them because I grew up there. And I think what's happening is there is not enough information at the local level for people to understand what's actually going to happen in the ocean. The impression when I talk to people back home is that there's going to be things getting blown up, like mining on land, but they really haven't looked into what actually happens and how the stuff is mined, especially how Impossible Metals plans to mine this stuff. So I think I have many ideas, but I think that's a conversation for a different call. But I think the time and at least in the research that I've done, the time and commitment that you guys have at least shown to consider these things, to me, somewhat admirable compared to your competitors and the information that I've found. So I just want to say I appreciate that. As you know, someone who grew up there, most of my family's still there, my mom and siblings and stuff. So anyway, yeah, that was my comment.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate that. We're trying to be different, to outreach, to have the views of everyone in the community. And as I think people know, our technology is quite different. And you know, we believe that a few days after any mining would have occurred with our tech, you wouldn't even know that the mining had occurred, because we will not remove very much of the material and avoid all of the visible life. I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. Paul, Dr. Paul Krause, please ask your question.
Yeah, hi everybody, thanks. And I apologize, Matt, for missing the first part of this. But you know, one of the things that in the projects that I work on, when we look at cultural heritage is often not written down. It's often not understood in a book form. You can't go down a checklist. You really have to interact and talk with everybody. And I think to Saul's point, it's that long-term interaction and understanding of where the people come from and what their heritage is what helps drive the process and make the system work. So I do think that both Eric and Saul's comments about understanding the people and understanding where they come from and understanding the beliefs is very, very important in this. And we tend to try to do that, whether it's across Oceania or even across like North America or Canada with First Nations and Native Americans as well. So it's all really good comments, and I do think listening and talking and understanding is the real key here. So.
Thank you. Uncle Saul, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question based on the comments made by the gentleman from American Samoa, because he is saying that there is a path forward, but the path forward he describes is talking about Oliver's proposed ideas for mining and making a comment that it was going to be a process of mining that was not going to be disruptive to the seabed ecosystems. And the presentations that I've been with Oliver in the ISA, he is proposing a way of mining that he says is going to be so precise that it's going to pick up nodules from the seabed floor one at a time without disturbing the seabed floor. But this technology is not developed. It's not even demonstrated. It's an idea that he has, as opposed to mining that's been proposed by other mining corporations. So I want to be very clear that while Oliver is providing an idea, it is not a technology that Oliver has demonstrated. So yeah, it's a nice idea, but you have not demonstrated how that actually works and how your claim that it's not going to impact the environment. So I don't want that kind of perception to be what leads people to make decisions for whether or not mining should happen or not. So unless you demonstrate that, then I have not seen that yet.
It's a good point. We have demonstrated it in shallow water. We have taken the vehicle to about 2,000 meters off in the Atlantic Ocean. We will this year demonstrate picking up commercial nodules with our technology. So we're kind of at TRL level 6, meaning we still have work to do to scale to full-size production. But over the last 5 years, we have demonstrated the base concepts, although not on a commercial nodule field yet, although I expect we will achieve that milestone this year.
Can I make a response comment to that real quick?
Please.
Mr. Soul. Mr. Soul, I appreciate your response. I just want to say there's a reality here that we must face. Deep sea mining is going to happen. The question is who's going to do it. And so if you want to just put, if you want us to just put our heads in the sand and let China do it all over the world, well, we may all need to learn how to speak Mandarin soon. That's the reality we face. So the question is, which horse are we going to back in this race? And as far as the research I've done, Impossible Metals is proposing an idea that might be the best solution for both parties moving forward, the deep sea mining pro community and the deep sea mining con community. We can't just ignore that reality.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we fully admit that our tech is not yet ready to go at scale. We have work to do, but we're very confident that we will complete that work over the next couple of years and be ready. And we're keen to publicly demonstrate, show the results. We have a commitment with the German contractor to do a full mining test next year, and that will have at least 30 scientists on board documenting and publishing all of the results. So we're committed to doing this, but we think we do provide a viable alternative, although, as I said, we still have some work to do to scale up. Sabrina, this will probably be the last question because we're on the hour, but please unmute and ask your last question.
Thank you. I also just want to acknowledge that Impossible Metals has done a lot more outreach than most of the other companies that are involved with deep sea mining. So, I applaud that effort. But I just want to be clear, American Samoa's opposition has been very strong. Again, we express a no right away because of environmental risk, but a lot of our cultural ties are to the ocean. And so I just want to share that it's not a matter of picking the lesser of the two evils, but for Oliver, I just want to share, and everyone here is American Samoa has said no. And so maybe moving forward, what does that look like if there are supposed to be more talks about why this is significant to us and us saying no? Thank you.
Yeah, no, appreciate that input. And I think, as the other person from American Samoa said, there are different voices. I do accept the majority of the voices are opposed right now, but hopefully there can be opportunities for the communities that will allow them to reevaluate their decision, jobs, economic growth, etc. But I think we should wrap. And Matthew, do you want to say any final words?
I appreciate the conversations. I think they're all good ones to have, and this idea of thorny points of contention and long conversations. This industry has been going on for 50 years in various fits and pieces. So I think it's just, it's important that we sort of establish these best practices so that we could do things as responsibly as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end, and we really respect and encourage all of the dialogue, and I appreciate all of the people participating and sharing their views. So yeah, this webinar will be posted to YouTube next week. Everyone will get a link. Thank you again for all of everyone's participation. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing the material. Really appreciate it.